They violated the treaty. Now a human diplomat delivers their reckoning. The data file was already 3 inches thick when they handed it to me, and I had read every single page before the shuttle cleared Earth's orbital lane. I did not read it because I was nervous. I read it because the people at Veldoran deserved someone who knew their names. My name is Mara Voss. I am 41 years old. I have spent 16 of those years in the diplomatic corps, and in all that time, I have never once been given a sealed order that felt light in my hand. The one sitting on the seat beside me that morning weighed almost nothing physically, but every time I glanced at it, I felt the pressure of an entire planet behind it. The shuttle was small, clean, and fast. 2 pilots up front named Owen and Claire. No guards, no entourage, no press attaché following me with a recorder trying to capture history in real time. Just me, a travel bag, and a data slate full of reasons why a civilization older than Rome had decided to burn down a colony of 12,000 people who had done nothing to anyone. I opened the casualty report again, not because I needed to review it. I had the numbers memorized. I opened it because I needed to feel what those numbers meant before I walked into the grand deliberation hall of the Cathari Dominion and stood in front of the species that caused them. 4,211 confirmed dead. Civilian settlements. The eastern agricultural quarter of Veldoran, which had been producing grain exports for 6 neighboring systems. A medical station. A school for young children. The Cathari fleet had arrived without warning, broadcast a 10-minute evacuation notice that their own communication specialists later admitted was transmitted on a frequency no human receiver could pick up, and then proceeded to level everything that stood within 40 kilometers of the colony's central hub. They called it a cleansing operation. They submitted a legal brief to the Galactic Assembly, arguing that a footnote in an addendum attached to the Concord of 5 Suns, the peace treaty we had both signed 11 years ago, granted them supervisory authority over the Veldoran sector in the event of what they termed infrastructural encroachment. I had read that addendum too. 14 times. There was no such clause. There never had been. The document they presented to the Assembly bore a section number that did not exist in the original ratified version. It had been inserted after the fact, quietly, with the kind of precision that suggested they had spent years preparing for a moment when they might need it. The Galactic Assembly responded with 3 committees, a joint mediation panel, and a strongly worded communiqué urging all parties to pursue dialogue in good faith. The communiqué used the phrase, "in good faith," 4 separate times. I counted. My government sent me. I pulled up the star chart on my slate and looked at the route we were flying. Straight into Cathari space, direct approach, no zigzag course designed to look non-threatening. Behind me, at a distance of exactly 200,000 kilometers, flew the UES Constant Resolve. She was a heavy engagement vessel, one of 7 in active service. She carried weapons systems I was not cleared to know the full specifications of, and a crew of 900 who had been briefed on their orders in the same sealed envelope format as mine. Owen, the pilot, had not said a word about the Constant Resolve since we departed. Neither had Claire. They were professionals. But when I had walked the length of the shuttle shortly after launch to stretch my legs, I noticed both of them glancing at their rear sensors with a quietness that was not quite calm and not quite fear. It was something more honest than either of those things. It was the expression of people who understood exactly what was flying 200,000 kilometers behind them and were choosing, very deliberately, not to think about it too hard. I respected that. I had been assigned 3 briefing calls with the Directorate before departure. The first was operational logistics. The second was a legal review of the Concord and the fraudulent addendum. The third, with Director Adele Marsh herself, was shorter than either of the others. She had looked at me through the screen for a long moment before she spoke. She said, "Mara, you are not going there to make them feel better about what they did." I said, "I know." She said, "You are not going there to find a middle ground." I said, "There is no middle ground. 4,000 people do not have a middle ground." She nodded. Then she said, "The Constant Resolve will maintain legal distance at all times. She will not cross the boundary. She will not take any action, unless you are physically threatened, in which case the captain has full discretionary authority. But her presence is not symbolic. Do not let them think it is symbolic." I said, "They will know what she is the moment their sensors pick her up." Director Marsh said, "Good. That is exactly the point. We ended the call. I went back to reading the casualty file. Somewhere in the middle of the agricultural district section, I found a name I had not noticed in previous readings. A farmer named Leonard Okafor, age 67, who had been identified through his personal identification bracelet because nothing else remained. He had arrived at Vel Duran 22 years before the colony was even formally registered, when it was still a temporary settlement with a handful of prefab structures and no guarantee of permanent status. He had stayed. He had built something. He had become the kind of person a colony is built around, without anyone formally deciding that. I put the slate down. I looked out the shuttle window at the stars sliding past at travel speed, each one a quiet fire, burning in a darkness so vast that it made every human argument seem both impossibly small and impossibly important at the same time. I thought about Leonard Okafor for a while. Then I picked the slate back up and kept reading, because he deserved that too. Because all 4,211 of them deserved a diplomat who showed up knowing who they were, not just what had been done to them. By the time Cathari space appeared on our navigation display, a thin band of amber on the starfield ahead, I had read every name, every age, every profession, every piece of identifying information the forensic teams had recovered from Vel Duran. I had not wept. I had not needed to. What I felt was not grief, in the way most people imagine grief. It was something quieter and more solid. It was the particular kind of weight that settles into a person when they decide, completely and without reservation, that something is going to happen. Claire's voice came through the interior speaker. Ambassador Voss, we are entering the Cathari outer approach corridor. We have been cleared for entry by their border authority. ETA to Veth Prime is approximately 4 hours. I said. Thank you, Claire. I straightened the data slate on my knee. I looked at the sealed order beside me one more time. I did not need to open it again. I had read it once, and that had been enough. The Cathari High Council had agreed to receive me. They had done so because refusing a diplomatic approach would have looked worse than accepting one. And they were, above all else, a species that cared deeply about how things looked. That quality, I had learned in 16 years of diplomacy, was both a strength and a vulnerability. People who care how things look can always be shown something they do not want seen. I had quite a lot to show them. Behind me, at exactly 200,000 kilometers, the constant resolve followed in silence. Her sensors would be painting a full picture of Cathari space right now, cataloging every patrol vessel, every communication relay, every military installation within range. Not aggressively, just the way a person looks at a room when they walk into it for the first time and want to understand exactly where everything is. It is what professionals do. The stars outside the shuttle window were bright and countless, and indifferent to everything happening beneath them. I found that comforting. The universe did not need humanity to be right. It did not need the Cathari to be wrong. It simply continued, vast and quiet, while small things like justice and consequence played out in the thin band of space between civilizations. I was here to make sure one of those consequences happened on schedule. 4 hours to Veth Prime. I opened a fresh document on the slate, placed my 3 minutes of prepared remarks at the top, and read them again from the beginning. They were very short. That was entirely intentional. I have been inside 47 diplomatic halls on 31 different worlds, and the Grand Deliberation Hall of Veth Prime was, by any measurement, the most impressive. The ceiling rose nearly 60 meters overhead, carved from a single formation of pale blue mineral that the Cathari called, in their own language, a word that translated roughly to the stone that remembers. The walls curved inward at the upper levels, lined with recessed galleries, where observers from a dozen species sat in tiered silence. The central floor was a perfect oval of polished dark stone, interrupted only by the Cathari Council dais at the far end, and the single standing position reserved for the presenting party, which was currently me. I stood in that position alone, no legal team beside me, no translator in my ear, because I had learned formal Cathari 8 years ago and had not let it go rusty. No aide holding documents, because I was holding my own document. One data slate, standard size. I had not dressed for ceremony. I wore a dark gray diplomatic suit that fit well and communicated nothing beyond the fact that I had not come to perform. The High Chancellor of the Cathari Dominion was a being named Vel Shorath. and he looked at me from the center of the dais, the way I imagined an old tree might look at a passing season. Patient, slightly amused, entirely certain that whatever was about to happen would leave him exactly where he had always been. He was tall, as Cathari go, with the distinctive silver ridge coloring along the side of his neck that indicated council-level status in their hierarchy. His secondary eyes, the smaller pair situated above and slightly behind the primary set, were half-closed, a Cathari expression of relaxed superiority. He had seen diplomatic proceedings before, many times, and the half-closed secondary eyes said, without words, that he expected this one to proceed the way they all did. There were 14 members of the council. Behind me in the observer galleries sat delegates from 4 other species, the Tur-Hassani, the Marin Collective, the Oden, and a small group of beings from the Solveth border worlds who had no formal diplomatic status, but had been permitted to observe because the Cathari enjoyed having an audience. On my left, seated in the neutral observer chairs that ringed the oval floor, was a woman named Priya Sato from the Galactic Assembly's mediation office. She had arrived 2 days ahead of me. When I had passed her in the corridor before entering the hall, she had touched my arm briefly and said, "Please be careful with how far you push them." I had smiled at her and kept walking. Vel-Sharath opened the session with the formal address protocol, which in Cathari tradition involved a spoken recitation of the council's lineage going back 14 generations. It took 9 minutes. I stood and listened without expression. When he finished, he gestured toward the legal section of the dais, and the Cathari chief advocate, a sharp-featured individual named S. Kavari, rose and began to present. What followed was 42 minutes of the most polished legal construction I had encountered in my career. S. Kavari was genuinely talented. He built his argument layer by layer, beginning with the historical context of the Veldoran sector, moving through the original treaty language, then pivoting to the addendum, with such casual confidence that an observer who did not know the document well might have believed the relevant clause had always been there. He cited precedent from 6 previous Cathari territorial actions, all of which had been accepted by the Assembly. He used the phrase, legitimate supervisory actions 7 times. His voice never rose above a calm, authoritative register. He never looked uncertain. When he finished, the observer galleries shifted. A few of the Tur-Hassani leaned toward each other. I could hear soft translation murmurs from the Marin section. Vel-Sharath's secondary eyes opened slightly. He looked satisfied. I waited until the hall was completely quiet. Then I stepped forward and set my data slate on the presentation surface in front of me. I did not activate the display. I did not pull up a visual presentation. I simply looked at the council and began to speak in formal Cathari, without notes, without preamble, without the customary diplomatic opening acknowledgement. I said, on the 14th day of the 7th Assembly month, the Cathari Dominion conducted an armed operation against the civilian settlement of Veldoran. The operation resulted in the confirmed deaths of 4,211 individuals, all of whom held protected civilian status under Article 7 of the Concord of 5 Sons, as independently verified by forensic teams from the Tur-Hassani Authority, the Marin Collective, and the Assembly's own investigative office. The addendum cited by Advocate S. Kavari contains a provision, specifically Section 14, subsection 9, that does not appear in the ratified original treaty held in the Assembly archives, does not appear in the copy deposited with the Oden Neutral Registry at the time of signing, and does not appear in the copy retained by the Human Diplomatic Service. 3 independent document analysts, commissioned separately by 3 different neutral parties, have confirmed that the relevant text was added to the document after the Concord was formally signed and sealed. I picked up the slate and activated it. The display showed a single document. On the left side, the original treaty. On the right side, the Cathari version. The relevant section was highlighted in a calm, neutral blue. The differences were visible in under 3 seconds. I said, I am not here to debate this. Every independent arbiter in this room already knows what that comparison shows. I am here to tell you what happens next. The hall did not explode into noise. It did something more interesting. It went so completely silent that I could hear the faint atmospheric cycling in the upper galleries. Vel-Sharath's secondary eyes were fully open now. S. Kavari had stopped moving. In the observer section, Priya Sato had both hands flat on the surface in front of her, very still. A council member near the far end of the dais said something in a lower dialect of Cathari that translated roughly to, "She is calling us criminals in our own hall." I looked at him and said, also in the lower dialect, "I am presenting documented facts in your own hall. If those facts describe a crime, that is a separate matter." The silence came back, heavier than before. Vel Sharath straightened in the central chair. His expression had changed in a way that was subtle but unmistakable to anyone who had spent time reading Cathari body language. The relaxed superiority was gone. In its place was something more careful. He was looking at me the way a person looks at a staircase, when they realize they have already stepped off the edge. He said, formally, "The human ambassador will present her resolution position." I said, "I will present that position to the full council after the midday recess. What I am presenting now is the factual basis for that position, so that there is no ambiguity about what we are discussing when I do." Another council member objected on procedural grounds. I acknowledged the objection, cited the Assembly's Mediation Protocol Article 32, which permitted the presenting party to establish evidentiary foundation before entering resolution terms, and waited while the Council's own procedural officer confirmed the citation was accurate. It was. I had checked it 11 times. The recess was called. I shut down the slate display and picked it up. As the observers began to move in the galleries above, I heard the Tur Hassani delegates speaking to each other in low, rapid tones. One of them, I could tell from the cadence, was laughing. Not at me. I walked toward the side corridor where the waiting area had been prepared. On my way, I passed close to the observer section, and one of the Oden representatives, a quiet being named who went by the human pronounceable name of Kar, reached out and briefly touched the back of my hand in the Oden gesture that meant, approximately, "I see what you are doing." I kept walking. Behind me, in the deep space between Veth Prime and the outer boundary of Cathari territory, the constant resolve held her position and waited. Vel Shorath found me in the recess chamber, 17 minutes after the session broke. He did not send a representative. He did not have his assistant transmit a request for a private conversation. He simply appeared in the doorway with 2 members of his personal security and looked at me the way someone looks at a person when they have revised their assessment of them significantly upward and are not entirely pleased about it. I was sitting with a cup of plain water and the casualty file open on my slate, reading the agricultural district section again. I did not stand when he entered. In Cathari protocol, the standing gesture of respect was offered to the council when the session was formal. In private, between individuals of equal standing, it was optional. I had decided before I boarded the shuttle from Earth that I was going to treat every interaction with Vel Shoreth as being between individuals of equal standing, regardless of what he thought about it. He sat across from me. His security positioned themselves near the door and stayed there. He looked at the slate in my hand for a moment, then looked at me, and said in the informal register, "You came here alone." I said, "I came here with exactly what I needed." He said, "You came here with a comparison document and 3 minutes of prepared remarks. My legal team spent 6 weeks on their presentation." I said, "Your legal team spent 6 weeks building a very elaborate structure around a document that does not say what they needed it to say. That is a significant investment of effort, and I understand why they made it. But the foundation was compromised before they started. Nothing built on it holds." He was quiet for a moment. Outside the chamber window, the pale orange sky of Veth Prime moved with slow, high-altitude cloud formations. The planet itself was genuinely beautiful. I had thought so when the shuttle descended, and I thought so now, and I did not let that observation soften anything about why I was sitting in this room. Vel Shorath said, "The Vel Duran sector has strategic significance to us that predates the Concord." I said, "I know. That is in your strategic planning documents from 20 years ago, which are part of the record that the Assembly's investigative office reviewed. The sector's value to the Dominion is not in dispute and never was. What is in dispute is the method you chose when you decided to act on it." He said, "The method was unfortunate. There were civilian losses that we did not anticipate at that scale." I looked at him for a long moment. I said, 4,211 people. The youngest was 4 years old. Her name was B. Her mother's name was Caroline. Her father's name was Simon. They are all in the file. Every one of them is in the file, and I have read every one of them, And I want you to understand that when I present the resolution terms to your council this afternoon, I am presenting them on behalf of every name in that file, not on behalf of an abstract political position, not on behalf of a treaty clause, on behalf of 4,211 specific people who are no longer here. Vel-Shorath did not look away. I had expected him to. He did not. He held my gaze with the primary pair, and something moved in the secondary pair. Some expression I did not have the vocabulary to name precisely, but which felt, in that moment, like the closest thing to genuine recognition I was going to get from him. He said, "And what do your resolution terms look like?" I said, "They are not complex. The Cathari Dominion will transfer the equivalent of 40 years of colonial economic output to a reparations fund administered by the Assembly Neutral Office, with distribution supervised by representatives elected from the surviving Vel-Duran population. The Dominion will withdraw all military and administrative personnel from the Vel-Duran sector within 30 days. The Dominion will submit a formal acknowledgement of treaty violation to the Assembly record, signed by the full Council, within 45 days. And within 60 days your Dominion will enter negotiations for a revised and expanded concord with civilian protection language that I have already drafted, and which closes every ambiguity the original document contained." Vel-Shorath said, "That is not a negotiation. That is a list of demands." I said, "You are correct. It is a list of demands. I did not say I was here to negotiate. What I said, in front of your council, and every observer in that hall, was that I was here to tell you what happens next. This is what happens next." His secondary eyes narrowed. He said, "And if the Dominion finds these terms unacceptable." I opened the map on my data slate and set it on the table between us without a word. It showed the full extent of Cathari space, marked with the 3 colony worlds the Dominion maintained outside their core territory, the primary trade corridors connecting them to the Assembly's central market network, and the resupply lines running between the outer Cathari installations and their home system. The Constant Resolve's current position was not marked on the map. It did not need to be. Vel-Shorath looked at the map for a long time. I said nothing. I had learned very early in my career that silence, used correctly, is the most powerful tool in any room. Words can be argued with. Silence makes a person argue with themselves, and people are almost always harsher with themselves than any diplomat could be. He said finally, "You are describing consequences." I said, "I am. I want to be very clear with you that I am not making a threat. A threat is what you make when you are not certain the outcome will go the way you intend. I am not uncertain. I am describing what will happen, not what might happen." He stood. His security shifted slightly near the door. He said, "The council will reconvene at the second bell." I said, "I will be there." He walked to the door, paused, and without turning said, "You are not what we expected from a human diplomat." I said, "You expected someone who would be grateful for an audience. You expected someone who would be careful about your feelings because you are older and larger and have more ships than we do. You expected someone who needed this meeting to go smoothly because a bad outcome would embarrass her government." I picked up the data slate. I said, "I do not need this meeting to go smoothly. I need it to produce a specific result. Those are 2 very different things." He left. The door closed with a soft, final sound. I finished the water in my cup, set it down, and looked out the window at the orange sky for exactly 60 seconds. Then I opened the slate, pulled up the resolution document, and read it through one more time. Not because I had forgotten any of it, because I wanted it fully present in my mind when I walked back into that hall and presented it out loud. In the corridor outside, I heard movement. Cathari staff moving quickly. More than routine recess activity. Vel-Shorath was talking to someone. The cadence was urgent. Good. The council chamber felt different when I walked back in for the afternoon session. The difference was not in the architecture or the lighting, or the arrangement of delegates in the observer galleries. It was in the quality of the attention. Before the recess, the observers had been watching with the politely curious energy of an audience that expected a standard proceeding. Now they were watching the way people watch when something unexpected has already happened, and they are not sure what is coming next, but they know it will matter. Priya Sato was in her observer seat. When I passed close to her position on my way to the presentation floor, she did not touch my arm this time. She looked at me with an expression I had seen on exactly 2 other people in my career. Both of them senior diplomats who had been in high-pressure situations and had come out the other side intact. The expression was not admiration. It was closer to recognition. One professional, observing another, and seeing clearly, maybe for the first time, what they are actually capable of. I nodded at her. She nodded back. I took my position on the oval floor. The council was fully seated. Vel-Shorath was in the center chair, and his expression was composed in the way that takes real effort to maintain. He had spent the recess talking to people. I could see it in the slight tension around his primary eyes and the angle of his shoulder ridge, which in Cathari body language indicated a being who has recently received information they did not enjoy. I presented the resolution terms in full, in formal Cathari, clearly and without ornamentation. I did not soften the language. I did not add diplomatic cushioning around the harder elements. I read them the way you read a legal document, which is exactly what they were. When I finished, the council had 60 seconds of formal silence, which their protocol required before any response. The 60 seconds passed. Escavari rose and said, in a tone that was still technically composed but was working hard to stay that way, "The human ambassador is presenting terms that the Dominion considers disproportionate, punitive, and incompatible with the established practices of galactic diplomatic resolution." I said, "I understand that is your position." He said, "A reparations figure of 40 years of colonial output is without precedent in assembly-mediated proceedings." I said, 4,211 civilian deaths in a single operation is also without precedent in assembly-mediated proceedings since the founding accord. The terms are proportionate to the event. I am open to the Council presenting a counterposition, but I want to be transparent that any counterposition which does not include the formal acknowledgement of treaty violation and the withdrawal from Vel-Duran is not something I am able to carry back to my government. One of the mid-council members, a being named Keth Varan who had been silent all morning, spoke. He said, "You are speaking as though the outcome of these proceedings is already settled." I said, "I am speaking as though I have read the same independent forensic reports that your own intelligence service has read and arrived at the same conclusion they have, which is that the evidentiary position is not something that improves with additional argument. I am speaking from that position, yes." The hall murmured. Not loud, just a kind of collective shift in the atmosphere of the room, like a pressure change. The Tur-Hassani chief observer requested the floor, and was granted it. He was a long-bodied, slow-moving being named Ul Mareth, and he had been the Tur-Hassani assembly representative for longer than I had been alive, he said, in assembly common tongue. The Tur-Hassani observation team wishes to note for the record that the document comparison presented by Ambassador Voss this morning has been reviewed by our own technical analysts during the recess break. Our analysts confirm the finding. The addendum section in question is not present in the version of the Concord held in Tur-Hassani Neutral Archives. Another pressure change in the room, this one larger. El-Shorath did not look at Ul-Marath. He looked at me. I let him look. The Odin representative, Carr, did not speak. Carr simply placed a small sealed document on the surface of the observer desk in front of them, in full view of the council, and waited. Everyone in the hall understood what a sealed document placed visibly on a surface during proceedings meant in Odin diplomatic tradition. It meant a formal record was being made that would be submitted to the Odin Neutral Registry, regardless of how the proceedings concluded. Escavari sat down. He did it slowly, with the controlled movement of a person who is processing a significant revision of their expectations. Vel-Shorath said, "The Council will require a period of internal consultation before responding to the resolution terms." I said, "I understand. I will be available until tomorrow morning at the second bell. After that, I am scheduled to depart." He said, "The consultation will require more time than that." I said, "I appreciate that there is a great deal to discuss. I want to be transparent that the resolution terms include a 60-day clock on the final action items, but the formal acceptance of the terms is what starts that clock. The sooner the Council communicates an acceptance, the more time the Dominion has to manage the practical elements in an orderly way." He said, "And if the Council requires more than until tomorrow morning?" I said, "Then I will depart. The file will be transferred to the Assembly's formal dispute mechanism, and the 60-day clock will be replaced by the Assembly's standard enforcement timeline, which, as the Dominion is aware from the Hadrath proceedings 12 years ago, tends to run considerably faster, and with considerably less flexibility, than a direct diplomatic resolution. The mention of the Hadrath proceedings was deliberate and specific. 12 years ago, a smaller species called the Hadrath had attempted to litigate a territorial dispute through the Assembly's formal mechanism after a direct diplomacy window closed. The result had been complete and fast, and had not been kind to them in any of the ways they had hoped. The Cathari had watched those proceedings closely. They had drawn conclusions from them. I could see from the shift in Vel-Shorath's posture that the mention landed exactly where I intended it to. He called an end to the afternoon session and dismissed the observers. I walked back to the corridor, and this time I did not look at Priya Sato's face, because I did not want to see any expression on it that would make me feel like what I had just done was a performance rather than a job. It was a job. An important one, but still a job. My comm chimed as I reached the corridor. It was the Constant Resolve's communications officer, a young man named Eddie Park, relaying a routine position update. Position unchanged. All systems nominal. Standing by. I sent back a 2-word acknowledgement. Standing by. That night, in the modest quarters the Cathari had provided for the human delegation, I did not sleep well. Not because I was afraid of how the next day would go. I was not afraid. I was alert, which is a different thing. The kind of alert that comes from knowing you are in the right place doing the right thing, and that the outcome is not yet certain, which means you cannot afford to stop thinking. I read the casualty file again. Not all of it, just the section on the Eastern Agricultural District. Just Leonard Okafor, and the 12 other long-term settlers who had been there before the colony was formally registered. The ones who had built the foundations that everyone else had built on top of. I thought about what it means to build something in a place that is far from everything familiar, without knowing whether it will last. I thought about the kind of courage that requires, not the loud, dramatic kind, the quiet, daily kind, the kind that gets a person up before sunrise to check the grain levels, and goes to sleep after dark, knowing the same work will be there tomorrow, and being fine with that. I thought about it until I fell asleep with the slate on my chest. 6 hours before my stated departure time, Vel-Shorath's sealed acceptance arrived on a standard communication channel. Not encrypted, not delivered through a formal ceremony, just a file, transmitted quietly at 4 a.m. Veth Prime local time, with a digital signature from all 14 council members. I read it in full twice. Then I got dressed, made a cup of plain water from the room's small preparation unit, and sat with it for a while in the quiet. The acceptance was complete. All terms. The reparations figure, the withdrawal timeline, the formal acknowledgement, the revised Concord negotiations. All of it, signed and dated. I had expected a partial acceptance, something that pulled back on the reparations figure, or pushed the acknowledgement language into softer wording that would allow some room for future interpretation. I had prepared for that possibility. I had a response document ready that drew a clear line between what I could flex on and what I could not, and the honest answer was that there was almost nothing I could flex on. They had not tried to flex anything. They had signed it as written. That told me something important. It told me that Vel-Shorath had spoken to their intelligence and military advisors during the night, and those advisors had looked at the situation clearly and told him the truth. That the forensic evidence was indefensible. That the Assembly observer nations had already begun preparing their own position papers. That the Constant Resolve's capabilities were not theoretical. That the document comparison Ul-Marath's team had confirmed was now in the Tur Hassani archive, regardless of what the council decided. That the Oden sealed record was already submitted to the neutral registry. They had looked at every angle and found that none of them led somewhere better than acceptance, so they accepted. I sent a brief message to Director Marsh. 4 words. Terms accepted in full. Her response came back in under 2 minutes. Good. Come home. I sent a position update to the Constant Resolve. Captain's name was Gordon Hale, a quiet and precise man whom I had met once at a joint briefing 6 months before this mission. He responded personally, which surprised me. He sent his acknowledgement through the official channel, and then, 30 seconds later, a second message, through a personal code, that said simply, "Well done, Ambassador." I held that for a moment. Then I drafted my response to Captain Hale. I said, "The work was done by 4,000 people who did not get to see the outcome. We just showed up." I think he understood what I meant. He did not respond again, and I did not need him to. The assembly floor session to formally register the agreement was scheduled for the following morning. I flew back to the deliberation hall in the same small shuttle, with Owen and Claire at the controls. The constant resolve remained at her position. Her sensors were still painting the full picture of Cathari space. She would hold that position until we were through the outer boundary and clear. The session was brief by assembly standards. Priya Sato presented the mediation office's formal record of the proceedings. I presented the signed acceptance document. The assembly's chief registrar, a methodical and thoroughly unhurried being named Solène, entered everything into the permanent record, with the solemn efficiency of someone who has done this many times and understands that the permanence of the thing is the point. When it was done, Solène looked up from the registration terminal and said, "The agreement is entered. The clock begins now." Vel Shorath was present in the hall for the registration. He had not been required to attend. His attendance was a choice. I did not know exactly what had prompted it, but I thought it might be the same instinct that brings people to the site of something significant even when their presence serves no practical purpose. Some things need to be witnessed. He did not speak to me. As I passed the Cathari observation section on my way out, he looked at me directly with his primary eyes, and his secondary eyes were fully open. In Cathari expression, fully open secondary eyes during a direct gaze meant something that translated into human terms imperfectly, but the closest approximation was, "I see you clearly now." I gave him a small, formal nod. I walked out of the grand deliberation hall of Veth Prime into the orange morning air, and I did not look back. In the weeks that followed, 4 separate species approached the human diplomatic office with requests for legal consultation on reviewing their own existing treaties with larger powers. 3 Cathari-adjacent territorial disputes that had been sitting dormant in the Assembly's mediation queue for years were suddenly submitted for active arbitration, with all parties requesting neutral oversight. The revised Concord negotiations began on schedule, with a Cathari legal team that was notably quieter and more precise than the one that had presented for 42 minutes on the first morning. The reparations fund was established and began distribution. The surviving Veldoran population elected their oversight representatives. Construction teams arrived from 3 different assembly member states to begin the long, slow process of rebuilding what had been lost. The constant resolve returned to her home port without having discharged a single weapon system. Her captain filed a mission completion report that was, by the standards of mission completion reports for heavy engagement vessels, remarkably short. I wrote my own report. It was longer. It always is. Director Marsh read it and called me. She said, "You could have pushed for more on the reparations figure." I said, "Possibly." She said, "Why did you not?" I said, "Because 40 years of colonial output is what the forensic economists calculated as genuinely proportionate. If I had pushed for more than that, I would have been asking for something beyond what was fair. I am not interested in more than what is fair. I am interested in exactly what is fair, obtained in full, with no shortcuts and no softening." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Most diplomats in your position would have treated this as a chance to set a precedent that benefited us in future negotiations." I said, "This case was never about future negotiations. It was about 4,211 people at Veldoran. Every decision I made in that hall was made on their behalf, not ours." Director Marsh did not respond immediately. When she did, her voice had a quality I had not heard in it often. She said, "I know. That is why we sent you." I filed the completed mission report. I cleared the casualty file from my data slate, not because I wanted to forget it, because I had carried it as a working document for the duration of the mission, and the mission was complete, and holding on to it past its purpose would have been something else, something personal. I did not have the luxury of making this personal, because if I made it personal, it became about me, and it was never about me. I archived the file instead, saved it to a permanent record with a note attached. Not for official purposes, for mine. The note said, "I read every name. I knew who they were. I hope that mattered." I believe it did. The day I returned to Earth, I had a meeting scheduled with 3 junior diplomats who were preparing for their first assignment-level postings. I had agreed to the meeting 6 weeks before the mission and had not canceled it, which meant I was sitting in a briefing room, 8 hours after landing, still operating on 4 hours of sleep, answering questions about career preparation and assignment strategy and how to read a room in a foreign diplomatic setting. One of the three, a young woman named Alice Crawford, asked me at the end of the session, "Is there one thing you always carry into a difficult negotiation?" I thought about the data slate, the casualty file, Leonard Okafor and his identification bracelet, and the 22 years he had spent building something that mattered to him on a world far from where he started. I said, "Yes, the reason." She said, "The reason for what?" I said, "The reason you are in the room. Not the strategic reason, not the political reason, the actual reason. The people who sent you there, the people who are affected by the outcome. If you always know exactly who you are in that room for, the rest becomes much simpler. Not easy, but simple." She wrote it down. I hoped it stayed with her for a long time. The Constant Resolve was docked at the orbital station by the time I landed. I did not visit the ship. Captain Hale and his crew did not need me to. They had done their part, and it was the same part the casualty file had done, and the same part the document comparison had done, and the same part the sealed Odin record had done. Every element of what had happened at Veth Prime had worked because it was true, and because it was precise, and because nobody involved in our side of it had flinched. The Cathari had expected a diplomat who needed the meeting to go well for her own sake. They had expected the kind of professional who, when the other side pushes back softer. They had expected someone who understood that they were the older, larger, more experienced party in the room and would behave accordingly. They had not understood what we had learned, across centuries and generations, through every failure and every hard lesson that history handed us. We do not send diplomats when we are uncertain. We send diplomats when we are prepared to be fair. We carry the weight of every person affected by the outcome into the room with us, and we do not put that weight down until the work is done. The warship behind the shuttle was not theater. It was the truth, made visible. And the truth, when it is precise and documented and witnessed by enough people to matter, does not need to raise its voice. It simply needs to arrive.